A storm can destroy a house in a single night, but sometimes it's not the storm outside that breaks us, it's the storm inside. This is the story of James, a man who once had everything, and then in what felt like the blink of an eye, lost it all. His journey is one of despair, but also of resilience, of rediscovering hope when hope seemed impossible, and of finding purpose in the very place he thought his life had ended. James wasn't born into riches, but he built a comfortable life. A steady job, a modest home, and friends he could count on, or so he thought. For years, life felt stable, predictable, safe. But life doesn't always give warnings before it takes a turn. Sometimes, the ground beneath your feet simply disappears. It started with a layoff. His company, the place he had given years of his time and energy, suddenly decided his role was no longer needed. "We're sorry," they said. But the truth was, they weren't the ones who would watch bills pile up, or wonder how to pay rent, or feel their savings evaporate. That was James's burden. At first, he thought it was temporary. "I'll bounce back quickly," he told himself. But weeks turned into months, and rejection emails replaced job offers. Slowly, the walls of his life began to close in. The home he once returned to with pride became a memory, replaced by cold benches and sleepless nights under the open sky. And then, perhaps even worse than the material loss, came the silence. The friends who had once filled his phone with calls and messages stopped picking up. He felt abandoned, invisible, as if losing his job had erased his value as a person. Can you imagine that? One day, you're surrounded by people who claim to care, and the next, it's as though you don't exist. Have you ever felt that kind of loneliness, where the world moves on without you? If you have, share it in the comments below. You might inspire someone else who feels the same way. James would sit under the stars at night, staring at the sky, whispering to himself, "Why me? Why did everything vanish?" But as we'll discover together, life has a strange way of teaching us lessons when we least expect them. Sometimes, when we lose everything, it's not the end, it's the beginning of something greater. And before we dive deeper into James's incredible journey, I just want to pause and ask you for something small. I worked hard to bring you this story, to make it as meaningful and powerful as possible. If you value stories that touch the heart and inspire resilience, please subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the stories yet to come. Your support truly keeps this work alive. Long before James lost his job, his home, and his friends, life had already been testing him. You see, James was no stranger to struggle. He didn't grow up with wealth, or safety, or the comfort of knowing things would always be okay. His childhood was stitched together with sacrifice, hard work, and the constant shadow of uncertainty. His family lived paycheck to paycheck. There were times when the refrigerator was nearly empty, and dinners were made from whatever scraps could be stretched into a meal. James learned early what it meant to go without. But in that scarcity, he also learned the value of persistence. He remembered watching his parents work themselves to the bone, late nights, early mornings, never complaining, even when exhaustion painted their faces. They taught him that survival wasn't about ease, it was about endurance. And so, from a young age, James carried that same grit inside of him. Still, even as he worked hard, he often felt invisible. At school, he wasn't the kid with new shoes or fancy gadgets. He was the kid who quietly held back, who sat on the sidelines while others flaunted what they had. And though it hurt sometimes, James carried on. He told himself, "One day, I'll make it. One day, I'll create the stability my family never had." And for a while, it seemed like he did. As an adult, James found work that paid well enough to cover his bills and give him that steady rhythm of life he once dreamed about. He wasn't rich, but compared to the boy who grew up with almost nothing, he felt like he had finally arrived. But here's the hard truth about life: it never forgets how to test us. The lessons James learned in childhood, about hunger, about sacrifice, about the pain of being overlooked, would all come back to test him again as an adult. Only this time, the storm would be bigger. Because when James lost his job, it wasn't just money he lost. It was the very thing he had worked so hard to build: stability. And when the people he trusted turned their backs, the old feeling of invisibility returned. He was once again that boy on the sidelines, wondering why life had chosen him to suffer. Have you ever felt like that? Like you worked so hard to finally stand on your feet, only to have life knock you down again? If you've ever been through that, share it in the comments below. Your story might remind someone else that they're not alone in their struggle. James could have given up then. Many would have. But there was something in him, something forged long ago in those nights of scarcity and struggle, that refused to let him break. The memory of his parents' sacrifice, the determination of that boy who once promised himself he'd rise above, it kept him going even when everything in him wanted to quit. He began to realize something important. Resilience isn't something you find when life is easy. It's something you discover in the middle of hardship. And while James was about to face some of the darkest days of his life, those very trials would also carve out the strength he didn't yet know he had. This was just the beginning of James's true test. And in the acts ahead, you'll see how loss, despair, and even small sparks of kindness would shape him into someone far stronger than he ever believed possible. When James first found himself on the streets, survival was his only goal. One day at a time. One meal at a time. One cold night after another. But slowly, quietly, something began to shift. It started with small moments. A stranger offering him a sandwich. A little child smiling at him on the sidewalk. A kind word from someone who didn't even know his name. These weren't grand gestures, but they planted a seed in his heart. I'm not invisible. I still matter. Then came the day he stumbled into a local shelter. At first, it was only about food. A plate of rice. A warm bowl of soup. The bare minimum to keep him going. But James was observant. And as he ate, he noticed the people who made those meals possible. Volunteers who weren't paid, who didn't have to be there, yet they gave their time, their energy, and their hearts to strangers who had nothing. They didn't judge. They didn't look down. They served with a smile, as if every plate of food carried a message. You are worthy of care. Something in James cracked open that day. He realized he didn't want to just take. He wanted to give. He wanted to be part of that same light he saw in those volunteers. So he started small. He helped clean tables after meals. He swept the floors. He carried boxes. At first, no one expected much from him. But James poured himself into it, because for the first time in months, he felt useful again. And slowly, giving back started to fill the emptiness that losing everything had left behind. Soon, James wasn't just surviving. He was changing. He discovered that when he gave, even something as simple as a smile, a helping hand, a word of encouragement, he felt stronger. He felt alive. And then came the dream. Not the dream of wealth, or status, or even returning to his old life. But something greater, to serve. To take his pain and transform it into a purpose. To remind others, especially those who felt invisible like him, that they still mattered, that life wasn't over. He realized his goal wasn't about getting back what he lost. It was about building something new, something rooted not in money or comfort, but in meaning. Have you ever felt that pull before? That voice inside whispering that your purpose is bigger than your pain? If you've ever had a dream that rose out of hardship, share it in the comments. Someone might need to hear it today. James's new dream gave him fuel. Even when he was tired. Even when rejection and loneliness still haunted him. That vision of being someone who could make others feel seen, the way those volunteers made him feel, kept him going. And as we'll see in the next chapter of his story, life wasn't finished testing him. Because every dream worth having will face resistance. And James was about to collide with challenges that would shake him to the core. But this time, he wouldn't face them as the man who had lost everything. He would face them as a man who had begun to find his purpose. Every dream, no matter how noble, comes face to face with resistance. And for James, just as he began to feel hope again, life tested him harder than ever before. At the shelter, he had begun to find rhythm. Sweeping, serving, listening, encouraging. For the first time in months, he felt like a man with purpose instead of a man who had been discarded. But purpose doesn't erase hardship, and hardship came knocking again. One bitter winter week, the donations at the shelter slowed. There wasn't enough food for everyone. James, though hungry himself, gave up his portion to a mother and her 2 children who had walked in shivering. They need it more than me, he told the volunteer. That night, he went to sleep on the same hard bench he'd known for months, but with a hollow stomach and a heavy heart. The following days weren't kinder. Rejections from job applications piled up. Doors closed in his face. He watched people cross the street to avoid making eye contact with him, as though poverty was contagious. And deep inside, the old voices returned, "You're nothing. You'll never stand again. This dream is pointless. There was one night, colder than the rest, when James nearly gave in. The hunger, the loneliness, the exhaustion, it all pressed down at once. He sat under a flickering streetlight, staring at his worn shoes, whispering, "Maybe this is it. Maybe I was a fool to think I could rise again." Have you ever been there? That breaking point where your mind tells you to quit, where the weight of life feels heavier than your strength. If you've ever felt that way, share it in the comments. You might remind someone else that they're not the only one fighting through the darkness. But here's where James's story takes its turn. Because in his darkest hour, something unexpected happened. The very next morning, one of the shelter coordinators noticed how tirelessly James had been helping. She pulled him aside and said, "We've seen how much heart you put into this place. We can't pay much, but we'd like to offer you a small role here. Will you take it?" Tears welled in James's eyes. After months of hearing no, this was the first yes. It wasn't a glamorous job. It wasn't a corporate office or a big paycheck. But it was a chance. A doorway back into dignity. And in that moment, James understood something powerful. Sometimes the path forward doesn't look like the path you planned. Sometimes, purpose shows up disguised as hardship, and resilience means choosing to walk through doors you never imagined would open. This job at the shelter was small by the world's standards, but to James, it was everything. It was proof that his dream wasn't a fantasy. It was real. Working at the shelter gave James something he hadn't felt in a long time: dignity. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was meaningful. Each day, he swept floors, served meals, and spoke with people who felt as broken as he once did. But even with this small job, life didn't suddenly become simple. The pay barely covered the essentials. James still struggled to find steady ground. Nights were long. Bills still haunted him. Some days, the weight of survival pressed down so heavily that he wondered if he was strong enough to keep going. One evening, after a grueling day of work, James sat outside the shelter. The winter air cut deep. His body was tired, but it was his spirit that ached the most. He whispered, "I'm trying so hard, but it feels like I'm barely moving forward." And haven't we all felt that way? Those seasons where no matter how much effort we give, life seems to push us 2 steps back for every 1 step forward? Have you ever been there, working, struggling, giving everything you have, yet still feeling like it's not enough? If you have, share your story in the comments. It may be the encouragement someone else needs to keep going. James was at that breaking point. But just when he thought he had nothing left, kindness appeared again. A man who regularly donated to the shelter had noticed James. He saw how James wasn't just doing tasks, he was lifting people, encouraging them, serving with heart. One day, the man approached him and asked, "What's your story?" James hesitated at first, ashamed of how far he had fallen. But he shared. He told the man about the layoff, the friends who had disappeared, the nights on park benches, and the small flicker of purpose he had found through service. The man listened carefully. Then he said words James would never forget. "You have a strength most people don't. You turned pain into service. I think the world needs more of that." A week later, the same man returned with an opportunity. He owned a small business and needed someone dependable, someone with character. He offered James a steady position. Not charity. Not a handout. A job. For James, it was like the clouds had finally parted. After months of rejection, after nights of despair, after wondering if he'd ever stand again, here was a chance to rebuild, to rise. And he hadn't found it by chasing money or status. He found it by living out his purpose, by choosing to give even when he had nothing left. That act of kindness, that belief from a stranger, changed everything. It was proof that small acts, a conversation, a listening ear, a simple offer, can completely transform someone's future. The new job wasn't glamorous. It wasn't the kind of position James once held in his corporate life. But it was steady. It was honest. And most importantly, it was a second chance. With each paycheck, James began to slowly rebuild. He found a small room to rent, no longer needing to sleep on a park bench. He bought clothes that made him feel human again. He could finally stand a little taller, no longer hidden under the weight of shame. But here's what made James different now. He wasn't the same man who once measured life by stability alone. The hardships had reshaped him. The loneliness had carved out empathy. The hunger had given him gratitude. The storm had broken him open, and in that brokenness, he found purpose. Even as he worked his new job, James continued to volunteer at the shelter. He didn't need to, his circumstances were improving, but he wanted to. Because he remembered what it felt like to sit on the other side of that table, waiting for a warm meal, wondering if anyone cared. Day by day, he became a mentor to others. People who came in beaten down by life would find James there, ready with a smile, a listening ear, or a story that reminded them, "I've been where you are. And you can rise too." One evening, a young man at the shelter asked him, "Why do you keep coming back? You've got your life back on track." James smiled softly and replied, "Because helping others gave me back more than I ever lost. I can't stop now." And that was the full circle moment. The man who had once been invisible had become a source of hope. The boy who had known hunger and the man who had known despair had turned it all into fuel, to lift others up. Have you ever noticed that? How sometimes, the very pain that breaks us becomes the tool we use to heal others. If you've experienced that, if your hardest season ever gave you the strength to help someone else, share it in the comments. Your story might inspire more people than you know. Over time, James's story spread beyond the shelter. His resilience inspired others in the community. People began to see him not as the man who lost everything, but as the man who found his purpose. And here's the miracle. What he thought was the end of his life was actually the beginning of his calling. Losing everything forced him to see what truly mattered. And in that loss, he discovered a gift far greater than stability or comfort. He discovered resilience. He discovered meaning. He discovered himself. James's story reminds us of something powerful. Losing everything doesn't always mean the end. Sometimes, it's life's way of clearing the path for something greater. Think about it. He lost his job. He lost his home. He even lost the people he once called friends. By all measures, his life had collapsed. And yet, in the ashes of that collapse, he found something far more valuable: purpose. Resilience isn't about avoiding the fall. It's about what you do after you've hit the ground. James showed us that even in the darkest seasons, there are sparks of light, a kind stranger, a helping hand, a moment of kindness. And if you hold on to those sparks, they can ignite a fire strong enough to carry you through. The shelter gave him more than food. It gave him meaning. And in serving others, James discovered the truth. When you give, even in your emptiness, you receive something greater in return. Strength. Gratitude. Hope. Maybe you're watching this right now and you feel like James once did, standing in the middle of your storm, wondering if life will ever get better. If that's you, let his story remind you, this isn't the end. You are stronger than you realize. Your purpose might be hidden in your pain, waiting for the moment you decide to rise. Have you ever had a season where what you thought was the worst moment of your life became the turning point that shaped you into someone stronger? Share your story in the comments below. You never know who your words might inspire tonight. And as we close James's journey, I want to say something from the heart. I worked hard to bring you this story, to craft it in a way that doesn't just tell, but touches, that doesn't just narrate, but inspires. If this story moved you, if it gave you even a spark of hope, please subscribe to the channel. That small act helps me keep creating stories that remind us all of the resilience, kindness, and purpose hidden inside each of us. Because in the end, storms will come. But storms also pass. And when they do, what's left behind is stronger, braver, and more beautiful than before. Meaning. He discovered himself.